Chapter 70. Judgment of the Blade. Sonny looked at the wounded demon, a grim look of resolve on his face. At this point, there was no reason to argue. They had no other choice but to face the guardian of the island themselves. Sonny's bag of tricks was all empty anyway. In the end, their fates were still going to be decided by sharp blades. Someone was going to get killed, and someone was going to be the killer. How are we going to deal with his armor? Nephi's weighed the sword in her hand and glanced down. I will break through the armor. Can you create an opening? Sonny nodded, not wasting time on unnecessary questions. If Changing Star was certain of her ability to cut through the demon's carapace, he had no reason to doubt it. Creating an opening, that was not going to be easy. Even though the monster had suffered terrible injuries, he was still a force to be reckoned with. His size alone was going to pose difficulties. They would have to bring the behemoth down to his knees before even thinking of carrying out any sort of an effective attack. And he was not just going to stand still under their assault, either. But what else was there to do? While Nephi's was tying the golden rope to the branch, Sonny walked over to Cassie and lightly squeezed her shoulder. She tried to force a smile. I take it that the carapace demon is still alive. Despite the heavy, cold, dark feeling gripping his heart, Sonny tried to make his voice sound relaxed and carefree. Yeah, but just barely. Don't worry too much. This whole thing will be over in no time. One way or another, he added inwardly. Cassie's smile weakened. She was clearly not convinced by his clumsy attempt to reassure her. Sonny hesitated. Hey, have you ever eaten demon meat? The blind girl was clearly surprised by his question. What, no? Sonny grinned. How about a demon steak? I'm an excellent cook, I'll have you know. I think. Neph had sort of monopolized the preparation of food, so I had no chance to put all the knowledge from the wilderness survival course to practice. Teacher Julius had indeed spent a lot of time teaching him how to cook all kinds of seemingly inedible things, as well as meats of all sorts of nightmare creatures, in preparation for his journey into the dream realm. Here, hunger was as much of an enemy as the fiercest of monsters. As soon as we get our hands on some demon meat, I'll make you a steak. It'll be the most delicious demon steak you had ever eaten, I promise. Finally, a real smile appeared on Cassie's face. She gave him a courteous nod. All right, that's a promise then. Meanwhile, Nephi's was done with the rope. She threw it down without hesitation and glanced at him. Are you ready? Sonny sighed and closed his eyes for a second, feeling the strength of his body being enhanced by the shadow. Yes, let's do this. As soon as their feet touched the ground, Sonny felt a heavy gaze burning a hole in his chest. Glancing up, he saw the crippled carapace demon staring right at him, a dark glint shining in his one remaining eye. The other one was gone, leaving only a bleeding black gap behind. At this distance, the damage dealt to the demon's body seemed even more debilitating. Its carapace was fractured in several places and covered in cracks, each seeping with azure blood. Sadly, none of the cracks were near the vital organs. His horns were shattered, as was one of his front legs, in addition to several rear ones that were either broken or torn off completely. The stumps of his two severed arms were pressed tight against his torso to stem the heavy bleeding. The other two were hanging to the ground, almost brushing against the ashen sand. The giant monster looked broken and tired. However, it was still terrifying, perhaps even more so than before, because, despite the horrible wounds, his gaze was still firm and full of evil intelligence. It was still radiating madness and bloodlust, which was now concentrated on Sonny and Nephi's, the architects of his sorry state. The first beams of the rising sun shone on the spikes covering the demon's once lustrous carapace, painting them in shades of burning crimson. Sonny summoned the azure blade and glanced at Nephi's. Be careful, he's lightning fast. He was the only one who had seen the terrible creature in action. As such, only he knew how dangerous the demon really was. Nephise nodded, not taking her eyes off the enemy, and stepped forward. The two of them walked toward the waiting carapace demon. Sunny was slightly ahead and aiming to circle the behemoth from the right, the side where the demon had both his last remaining scythe and eye. Changing Star was a step or two behind him, aiming to circle the creature from the left, the side where his pincer arm was slowly rising into the air. In this battle, Sunny's role was to take the brunt of the enemy's attacks, letting his partner deal the lethal blow when the time was right. Through the tacit understanding that they had developed through surviving dozens of life or death situations, the two of them were able to cooperate without speaking a single word, fighting almost as one. This was their main advantage. As they were closing in, Sunny felt a slight shift in the demon's posture. Instantly, he knew that hell was about to break loose. He had warned Nephise about the speed of their enemy, but he also had to deal with it himself. Sunny knew that he was much slower than the giant creature, but he still had to find a way to dodge the massive, terrifying scythe. That wasn't as bad as it seemed. Speed wasn't everything in a fight. Take, for example, Changing Star's training fight against the proud scion of the Han Li clan. Castor possessed an aspect ability that made him 10 times faster than the silver-haired girl, at least. However, in the end, he only won by a hair's breadth. Nephise had almost smashed his face with an unexpected elbow strike. She had been able to catch Castor unaware not because of her fast reaction. With that big of a difference between their speeds, no amount of reaction could have helped her. Instead, she was able to predict and manipulate the opponent's attacks, starting the strike even before Castor himself knew that he was going to end up in the path of her elbow. She was in control of the battlefield. And now they had to repeat that feat against the ancient demon of the Forgotten Shore. Luckily, his speed advantage was not nearly as insane as Castor's. Almost simultaneously, Sunny and Nephise lunged forward, attacking the behemoth from different sides. He also moved, ready to tear them apart. Both his pincer and his scythe rose into the air. Sunny was running as fast as he could, the azure blade outstretched behind him. A fire of cold resolve was burning in his heart. He was ready to live or die by his blade. However, in the next moment, his leg seemed to slip in the sand, and as his eyes opened wide, Sunny stumbled. Not wasting the opportunity, the carapace demon attacked. The terrifying scythe tore through the air, aiming to cut the helpless human in half. But it hit only sand. Sunny, who had feigned his loss of balance to bait the demon's strike, easily avoided the deadly blade by jumping to the side at the last second. He wasn't quite at the level where he could predict every move of the enemy. Instead, manipulating the enemy into performing a predictable attack was easier. After all, deceit and manipulation were his forte. Temporarily safe from the threat of the scythe, Sunny dashed toward the demon's legs. At the same time, Nephise had managed to avoid the massive pincer and was closing in on them, too. They reached their goals almost simultaneously, one from the right, the other from the left. Sunny slashed with the azure blade, feeling it hit the polished armor and bounce back without leaving even a slight scratch on it. Dull pain radiated through his hands. On the other side of the behemoth's massive body, Nephise achieved more success. She had attacked the already injured front leg of the monster, cutting deep into his flesh through the wide crack in the metal plate. Severely damaged, the leg wasn't able to support the weight of the giant creature anymore. It buckled, sending the demon reeling. At this point, a scavenger or a centurion would have lost their balance and fallen to the ground. However, the carapace demon was too smart and experienced. He compensated for the loss of another leg by shifting his body weight to the opposite side and thrusting his scythe into the ground to remain stable. Damn it! Sunny had really hoped that the bastard would fall down. because then he wouldn't have had to do what he was about to do next. But now there was no other choice. Cursing inwardly, Sonny briefly looked up at the massive body of the giant demon. Heavens only knew how much that thing weighed. Then, he held his breath and ducked right beneath the carapace demon's steel abdomen, with the carapace demon using his deadly scythe to support the weight of his body. Sonny was temporarily safe from its sharp blade. Of course, the monster had other means of attack. Each one of his towering legs was like a siege ram, dangerous and capable of devastating destruction. But at the moment, his position was too precarious to lash out with them. Sonny had at least a second to do whatever he wished to, with no risk involved. The only thing he had to avoid was going directly under the behemoth, thus putting himself in danger of being crushed to death by the demon's giant body. Coincidentally, that was exactly what he had to do. Crab, crab, crab. Glancing up at the massive armored creature, Sonny cursed and dashed forward. A moment later, he dove underneath the carapace demon, feeling the thick shadows swallow him whole. Instantly, Sonny was covered in cold sweat. There was nothing but polished metal and murderous intent above him now. All the monster had to do to turn the tiny human into a puddle of blood was to rest his body on the sand. Under the crushing weight, Sonny's organs would burst and his bones would turn to dust. There wouldn't be anything solid left of him at all, only a thin layer of bloody goo smeared across the ground. Not the best situation to find yourself in. With his nerves on the verge of melting, Sonny brandished his sword and rushed forward. His eyes were glued to the joints of Carapace Demon's legs. He was utterly focused, looking for the slightest movement, waiting for it. With no room for error, Sonny pushed every unnecessary thought and emotion into the farthest corner of his mind, not allowing dread, doubt, and his tendency to overthink things to slow him down even by a fraction of a second. Time moved excruciatingly slowly. It felt as though hours had passed, but in reality, it was only a couple of moments. Sonny was only at the second pair of the giant monster's legs. It was then that he finally noticed the almost imperceptible change in the demon's posture. The tension in his joint changed slightly, indicating that the behemoth was about to move. This was the sign that Sonny was both hoping for and terrified of. Now, his survival was wholly dependent on whether or not he was fast enough. As soon as his eyes had registered the change in the creature's posture, Sonny pivoted on one leg and dashed to the side, trying to get away from underneath the armored giant. A small cloud of sand was sent flying by his sudden turn. But the demon was incredibly fast. He threw his body down, determined to squash the odious invader like a bug. With inertia and the limits of his human body slowing Sonny down, he felt the metal surface of the carapace begin to fall down on his head long before reaching the safe zone. Death was approaching with abhorrent speed. One step, too, was he going to make it in time? The carapace demon fell to the ground with a thunderous crash, sending large clouds of sand into the air. The impact was so strong that the whole island trembled. The furious mass of falling metal and spikes missed Sonny by just a few centimeters. He flew from underneath the demon's body at the last possible moment by performing a desperate dive. Crashing into the sand, Sonny rolled away and jumped back to his feet, slightly disoriented by the shockwave of the giant's fall. I actually managed to survive. Sometimes life was full of surprises. But all jokes aside, he was not really astonished. His actions, while potentially fatal, had been deliberate and calculated. He was not in the habit of putting his life at risk without being sure that there would be at least a moderate chance of making it out alive. His actions were also always purposeful and pursued a specific goal. In this case, it was to bring the carapace demon down. Only by forcing the giant creature down to the ground, in reach of their blades, could they hope to kill it. In that sense, this dangerous gamble ended in resounding success. The bastard was now lying on his abdomen, his carapace and humanoid torso, where all the vital organs were situated, well in the changing star's attack range. Now Sonny just had to create an opening for her to deal the fatal blow, although he still had no idea about how she was planning to bypass the impenetrable barrier of the demon's armor. However, creating that opening was not going to be a trivial task. Despite the fact that the monster's mobility was now severely reduced, the distance between him and the two sleepers was also much smaller, which made dodging his attacks that much harder. Sonny was about to experience that hardship for himself. He was barely back on his feet when the terrifying scythe flashed through the air, threatening to slice his body in half. Sonny had no idea how Nephi's was doing on the other side of the creature's enormous body against the pincer, but dealing with the scythe was almost beyond his abilities. The burning eye of the demon that followed his every move was not helping the situation at all. With very little time to react, Sonny did the only thing he could think of. He jumped as high as he could and pulled his legs up to his chest, performing a very awkward forward somersault. Because of the number of shadow fragments he had consumed and the physical enhancement brought by the shadow, the height of his jump was nothing short of impressive by human standards. The scythe's blade whistled beneath Sonny, so close that he could feel the wind brushing against his face. Landing on the ground, he dashed forward. Sonny knew that the scythe would come back, but he had a second or two to change his position, getting in front of the behemoth. He had to make the giant creature forget about Nephi's completely and concentrate fully on dealing with him, and him alone. To do that, he had to get in range of both the scythe and the pincer. What a lovely task! Feeling that his time was running out, Sonny spun around and raised the azure blade. Just as he thought, the carapace demon was already bringing the scythe down at him again, this time in a ruthless horizontal thrust. The sharp tip of the scythe was flying through the air, aimed at his chest. However, he had slightly underestimated the demon's reaction time. As the result, there was already no time to dodge. One small mistake was the difference between life and death on the Forgotten Shore. The scene of their first fight against a carapace centurion flashed in Sonny's mind. The situation was eerily similar to this one, with the inescapable doom approaching him at the speed of lightning, too swift and close to be avoided. Brought by the blade of a carapace creature's scythe. But Sonny wasn't the same as he was before. Since that fateful battle, he had spent every day training, gaining experience and gathering power. He had fought his way through this hell, paying a price of blood for every step. He wasn't that easy to kill anymore. Instead of soft flesh, the scythe was met by the hard steel of the azure blade. Not only did Sonny block the blow, he even managed to angle the sword in a way that would deflect most of the impact, instead of absorbing the full force of it. One of his hands was placed on the hilt. The other gripped the tip of the blade with enough strength to prevent the edge from cutting his fingers off. The residual force was still enough to send him flying back, but it was not enough to break the bones in his hands, not with the shadow enhancing the resilience of his body. The azure blade, however, was not as lucky. With a sorrowful ring, the blade shattered, breaking off near the crossguard. Beautiful shards of blue steel fell to the ground. Sonny gritted his teeth, knowing what would happen next. The spell spoke, announcing the destruction of his trusty sword. "Your memory has been." He didn't get to hear the rest of the sentence, because, in the next moment, his body collided with the ground. Sonny bounced a couple of times, feeling flashes of pain radiating through his bones, rolled, and finally came to a stop. He was comparatively fine. Standing up, Sonny stumbled and barely managed to remain on his feet. He glanced around and noticed that the trunk of the great tree was not that far away. 24 meters away, the carapace demon was slowly turning his head, planning to concentrate his murderous rage on Nephi's. This was the exact opposite of what Sunny had to achieve. He had to attract the monster's attention somehow. But what could he do? As the remains of the azure blade began to shine with soft light in his hand, ready to disintegrate into a rain of sparks, Sunny raised his hand and threw the broken sword with as much force as he could gather. However, he didn't throw it at the demon. Instead, he threw it at the miraculous tree, as though trying to harm it. Not far away, the demon suddenly froze, even if only for a second. His scarlet eye followed the shining memory as it flew through the air, approaching the trunk of the great tree. Then the broken sword fell apart, turning into a shower of white sparks, which then disappeared without a trace. None of them even touched the obsidian bark. However, the azure blade had already fulfilled its purpose. It distracted the giant for a few precious moments. For Changing Star, that was more than enough. As soon as the carapace demon froze, distracted by the feigned threat to the great tree, Nephi's lunged forward. There was no hesitation, no doubt, not even the slightest pause between the moment her enemy had lowered his defenses and her reckless attack. Just like Sunny had been utterly focused on observing the monster's movements before, she had been watching and waiting for this exact moment since the beginning of the battle. Changing Star knew that, when the opportunity presents itself, it will only last for a second. Even that single second almost cost Sunny his life. Nephi's wasn't going to waste it. Her graceful figure flew through the air like an arrow released from a powerful bow, almost leaving afterimages behind. The silver blade of her longsword glimmered, reflecting the light of dawn. The black and white armor seemed to turn into a blur. She was going all in, rushing at the enemy without leaving herself even the slightest chance to retreat. Things were happening too fast for Sunny to form a coherent thought. He could only watch, time slowing down to a crawl, a storm of emotions raging in his mind. The demon reacted almost immediately, recognizing the threat, but almost didn't count on a battlefield. A moment of distraction was all it took to lose everything. That one mistake, no matter how small, had been enough to seal his fate. If Nephi's was really capable of breaking through the creature's indestructible carapace, that is. Otherwise, it was all for nothing, and they would be the ones dying instead. The fearsome giant moved his scythe, trying to slice her apart. The pincer flashed from the other side, threatening to crush her body into pulp, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Changing Star was just a tiny bit faster. As she ran, something changed about the cadence of her steps. Sunny couldn't see her face behind the visor of her helmet, but if he could, he would see a grimace of agony contorting Neph's pale face. In the next moment, a soft white radiance ignited beneath the skin of her hands. However, this time it didn't stay there. Instead, the white flame flowed outward, into the hilt of the silver sword, and then into its blade. The sword suddenly turned into a sharp, radiant edge, burning with incandescent white light. It shined so brightly that Sunny felt the desire to close his eyes. However, the radiance wasn't soft and warm anymore. Instead, it seemed to be capable of reducing anything it touched to ash and sharp enough to cut the fabric of the world itself. Perhaps it was even sharp enough to cut the strings of fate. Sunny remembered how Nephi's had described her aspect ability. It can be used for healing. Back then, he had suspected that this phrase of hers implied that there was more to it. He even marveled at how precious and rare such an ability would be. It seemed as though he was right. Changing Star's miraculous flame was capable of both healing and destroying. It possessed an enhancing effect similar to his own shadow control, at least when applied to weapons. Who knew what else it could do? An incredible ability indeed. Looking back, he understood that Nephi's had not tortured herself in vain. All the time she pretended to meditate while enduring the excruciating agony of her flaw in secret were meant to make this moment possible. to give her enough fortitude to use this ability in battle without passing out from the pain. She succeeded. The question was, would that be enough? Was her sword strong enough to break the mighty carapace of the awakened demon? After all, no matter how incredible the ability, it was still powered by a weak dormant soul core of a lowly sleeper. They were about to find out. A few steps away from the carapace demon's towering torso, Nephi's bent her legs and jumped, soaring high into the air. Her sword flashed forward in a vicious thrust, so fast that, for a moment, it looked like a beam of pure white sunlight. Then it collided with the strange alloy of the giant's lustrous armor, right at the spot where his heart was supposed to be. Of course, back when they were hiding in the dead Leviathan's empty spine, Cassie had told them about her vision. In that vision, she saw the carapace demon being attacked by a terrible creature of the deep dark sea. In the aftermath of the battle, the demon was severely wounded and on the verge of dying. The most horrible wound was on his chest, where the armor was torn apart and shattered, revealing the monster's beating heart. With time, all his injuries had healed. Except for this one. While the carapace of the demon seemed to have recovered, in truth, it was never fully restored. In this one spot, the armor was secretly weakened, and it was exactly to that spot that Nephi's had delivered her blow. It didn't matter whether her radiant sword was really capable of breaking through the impregnable armor of the awakened creature, because she attacked the only weak spot on his body, the place where his armor had already been broken. With a flash of white light, the incandescent sword pierced through the metal of the demon's carapace and plunged into his body, unleashing a fury of fire inside the adamantine shell. It seemed as though the giant was suddenly illuminated from within, with beams of light shining through the cracks in his armor. For a moment, the surreal sight was burned into Sunny's mind. Then, Changing Star's sword had reached the carapace demon's heart and sliced it apart, incinerating everything around it and making the azure blood of the fearsome creature boil and evaporate. Sunny's legs buckled, and he gracelessly fell on his ass. Wow, we did it. The demon staggered. His arms slowly rose as though trying to pull Nephi's into a final embrace. But then, as his body twitched, they fell to the ground. Neph landed in the sand and jumped back, ready to defend herself. But there was no need. The proud guardian of the Ashen Barrow was dying. The scarlet light in his one remaining eye was dimming, any semblance of intelligence quickly disappearing from his gaze. The demon heavily slumped, all remnants of strength abandoning his mighty body. Turning his head with incredible effort, he cast one last look on the great tree. Then his gaze stopped on Sunny. There was no fury or madness in that gaze anymore, only some strange, calm, inexplicable emotion. It almost felt like relief. Before Sunny could discern the meaning of that emotion, the last glimmer of light was gone from the eye of the carapace demon. His head rolled back and fell. They won. In front of the giant body, Nephi's had dismissed her helmet. Behind it, her face was pale and tired, her hair sticking to it in a sweaty mess. The afterglow of the white radiance was already extinguished, leaving her eyes gray once again. Changing Star kneeled, then lay down on her back, too exhausted to move. The whole fight lasted less than a minute, but it took everything out of both of them. Sunny followed Neff's example and lay on the ground, trying to catch his breath. They actually won. He couldn't quite believe it. I want to sleep for a week. Remembering that Cassie was still waiting in the branches of the great tree, not knowing who lived and who died, Sunny sighed. A few moments later, he deeply inhaled. Then, straining his vocal cords, he screamed at the top of his lungs. In the silence of the morning, in the center of the tall hill covered with ashen sand, under the branches of a beautiful giant tree, a strange shout could be heard. One demon stake coming right up. A few minutes later, Sunny heard a noise coming from somewhere above, Looking in that direction, he noticed that Cassie was standing at the edge of the wide branch, gripping the golden rope in her hands. Before he could react, the blind girl was already climbing down. She was very cautious, but also quite nimble for someone without sight. He blinked. Is she crazy? That's dangerous. But he was worried for nothing. Cassie quickly reached the ground and let go of the rope, safe and sound. She then summoned her staff and took a hesitant step, trying to remember where his shout had come from. Sonny made his presence known and guided her by saying, "I'm here." The blind girl turned her head in his direction and walked forward, carefully feeling the ground in front of her with the staff. Because of how uneven the surface of the island had become, it took her longer than usual to reach him. Just as she was about to walk past, Sonny spoke again. "Hey, Cass." Cassie stopped and lowered her head with a surprised expression. Then she asked, "Why are you lying on the ground?" He smiled weakly. "Ah, it's very comfortable." Suddenly, the blind girl frowned and asked in a worried tone, "Are you hurt?" Sonny shook his head with a sigh. His sense of humor was not always appreciated. In fact, it had often landed him in hot water in the past. "Just bruised all over, nothing serious. I'm just really tired. That one was really intense." Since Cassie was still frowning, he thought for a moment and added, "Neff is also fine. She's resting a bit further away." Finally, the delicate girl relaxed. Her face cleared and she offered him a hesitant smile. "You really killed that demon." Sonny cast a gaze at the giant corpse and closed his eyes. "Yeah, he's very dead." Both of them were silent for some time. Sonny was on the verge of falling asleep when Cassie carefully asked, "So, you're just going to continue lying here?" He opened his eyes and blinked, trying to remember what was going on. "Oh, right, it's morning. There are things we have to do." The last day was excruciatingly long and exhausting. They had to make preparations to execute the plan, race to the top of the hill, climb the great tree, hide themselves in its branches, risk their lives to set the demon on fire, not to mention all the stuff that happened after, all culminating in the short but terrifying battle against the creature itself. And yet it was not time to rest yet. They had to take basic precautions at least. Straining his exhausted body, Sonny stood up and offered Cassie his shoulder. After she placed her hand on it, he walked over to the carapace demon's corpse, stopping at the spot where Nephi's was sprawled in the sand. She greeted them with a tired glance. "Good morning." Out of habit, Changing Star tried to force a polite smile. However, today it did not look very convincing. I give it 3.6 out of 10. Not great, not terrible." Soon, the three of them were sitting in a circle, passing around the glass bottle full of cold, refreshing water. Sonny was in the middle of describing their fight with the carapace demon. So he got distracted for a few moments. That's when Neff attacked. She used her aspect ability to ignite her sword and struck at the weakened patch of armor on the demon's chest, the one you told us about. It really was not as strong as the rest of his carapace, so the sword went through and pierced the bastard's heart. Sonny noted that Cassie did not seem surprised at the mention of Changing Star's new trick. Either she knew all along because Nephi's had told her, or she saw something in one of her visions. Regardless, he decided not to press the topic. The demon was already severely wounded from his fight with the thing from the sea, so it was enough to finish him off. A few seconds later, he was dead. Cassie shook her head in astonishment. "That is incredible. 2 sleepers killing an awakened demon. I thought that stuff like that only happens in webtoons." Nephi's corrected her. 3 sleepers. Without your vision and advice, we wouldn't have been able to do anything." The blind girl lowered her face, a little embarrassed. "Still, 2 or 3, it doesn't really change a lot, does it?" Sonny looked from one girl to another, then finally turned to Cassie. You're right, it's not something one would expect to happen. But anyway, I promised to cook demon meat for you after this is over, didn't I? Are you ready to witness my incredible culinary talent? He smiled, already tasting the juicy, tender meat in his mouth. However, Cassie suddenly frowned, a hesitant expression appearing on her face. I don't know about that. He raised his eyebrows. Why? She lingered before answering. Well, it just seems weird to eat the meat of an intelligent creature, even if it was evil. I didn't think about it before, but now, it just doesn't seem right, I guess. Sonny blinked. Actually, he did not think about it either. In retrospect, the idea of making steaks out of a creature whose intelligence was comparable to theirs did seem a little wrong, even if that creature was a bloodthirsty demon who would have swallowed them whole without a second thought. It was just how things worked in the dream realm. Monsters devoured humans and humans devoured monsters. It was the circle of life, death, the circle of death. But the carapace demon was not only smart. He had his own thoughts and personality. Even though nightmare creatures were universally insane and obsessed with murder and destruction, just like he was, there were also other qualities to the ironclad giant. He was proud and fearless, even valiant. When fighting against the terrifying monsters of the dark sea, he did not hesitate to stand his ground, refusing to surrender. Cooking the meat of someone like that could indeed be considered strange. How come Teacher Julius did not educate me on the ethics of eating your enemies? What an oversight. Misunderstanding Sonny's silence, Cassie blushed and said, Sorry, I know it seems ridiculous, but that's just how I feel. You and Neff don't have to do the same. Sonny shook his head. No, you might be right. I understand, sort of. It's just that we didn't bring any supplies with us, so we won't be able to eat anything unless we go hunting. The blind girl sighed. Then her face brightened and she said, What about the great tree's fruits? I bet they're delicious. Sonny looked at her in amazement. Are you serious? Cassie was visibly confused by his question. Yes, why? He blinked a couple of times before answering. That tree is magnificent and pretty, but it's also very strange and suspicious. Why is it able to grow here when nothing else can? I'm pretty sure that it's the reason why all the coral around the Ashen Barrow is dead. Have you seen anything else capable of damaging the labyrinth itself? Sonny looked at Cassie, then at Nephi's, trying to show how serious he was about this. In any case, it's too creepy. I don't think that we should eat these fruits. Who knows what they'll do to us? The blind girl smiled. You're being a little paranoid, don't you think? A tree is a tree. Actually, I think it's a wonderful example of how life can prevail against all odds, even in this terrible place. I'm willing to bet that its fruits are perfectly fine. He stared at her, not knowing what to say. How could Cassie be so dismissive of his completely valid concern? That wasn't like her at all. Unpleasantly surprised, Sonny turned to Neff, hoping that she would support him. Changing Star thought things through before speaking. Then, she said in a measured voice, Sonny is right. There are too many strange things about that tree. Eating its fruits would be too risky. Finally, a voice of reason. He exhaled, relieved. However, his heart was still inexplicably gripped with worry. As Cassie sighed with disappointment, Changing Star turned to him and asked. The echo was destroyed. Sonny's face darkened. He was still pained by the loss of his loyal scavenger. Yeah, the demon acted faster than I had expected. He killed it before I could do anything. Nephi's frowned. Too bad, our speed will be severely reduced. Have you no heart, woman? At least pretend to be sad. My poor echo is gone. His shadow shook its head, amazed at the childishness of its master. Sonny was also surprised by his reaction, considering that his own first thought after the echo had died was about how much money he wouldn't be able to make by selling it. Yeah, it's a pity. Changing Star gave him a nod and then asked, "You also lost your sword?" Sunny sighed and gritted his teeth. "Yes, it shattered when I blocked the demon's scythe," which hurt even more than the death of his scavenger. Azure Blade was his first sword. He fought and trained with it for a long time. It was already like a part of him. And now it was gone. Nephi's raised a hand. "Well, you're in luck. I received a memory after killing the carapace demon. It's a weapon." Sunny's heart skipped a bit. Instantly, he forgot all about the Azure Blade. Yes, that sword held a certain sentimental value, but who the hell cares about sentimentality? It came from a carapace scavenger, which wasn't bad at all for his current rank. Few sleepers got to wield awakened weapons. But this new memory came from an actual awakened demon, a demon. That made it an awakened memory of the third tier, 2 whole tiers above the Azure Blade. There were 7 tiers in total, corresponding to the 7 classes of nightmare creatures, from beasts to titans. Strictly speaking, a higher tier did not always mean that a memory will be more powerful, but generally, the more advanced a creature was, the more unique and formidable memories it left behind. That's why the puppeteer's shroud, which came from an awakened tyrant and was thus considered to be a Tier 5 awakened armor, was so precious. "Please be awesome." Sunny tried very hard to not let his excitement show on his face. Pretending to be nonchalant, he kept his voice even and said, "Really, that's good." Nephi's took his hand, ruining all Sunny's attempts to appear calm, and closed her eyes. Hiding the startled expression on his face, Sunny felt a spark of energy travel from her body to his. It was just like that time he transferred the Starlight Legion armor to her, only in reverse. "You have received a memory, Midnight Shard." Cool name." He summoned the runes and impatiently searched for the description of his new weapon. Memory Midnight Shard. Memory rank awakened. Memory type weapon. Memory description. Forged from the shard of a fallen star, this stalwart blade is firm and unyielding. It favors those who are willing to fight to the last drop of blood and knows no surrender. Interesting. Not wasting any time, Sunny summoned the Midnight Shard. Immediately, an elegant sword appeared in his hand. The sword looked a bit like the Azure Blade, but only in the sense that it was single-edged and had a long hilt suitable for 2 hands. However, this was where the similarities ended. For starters, its blade was much longer, somewhere between 70 and 80 centimeters, and slightly curved. It was forged out of the same bright, lustrous metal as the carapace demon's armor. It was incredibly sharp. The hilt was made out of polished black wood, quite similar in appearance to the onyx branches of the great tree. The crossguard was round in shape and more pronounced than that of the Azure Blade, offering better support and protection to the wielder's hand. The sword had no decorations, no ornaments, no embellishments. It was simple and austere, like a true weapon designed for battle and battle alone. It seemed to radiate a cold, fearsome aura. As soon as his hand touched the Midnight Shard, Sunny felt that this sword possessed an unbreakable will. Its blade was strong enough to withstand devastating blows without suffering any damage. With this sword in his hand, nothing would be able to leave Sunny unarmed again. More than that, there was a strange new sensation somewhere deep in his heart. When Sunny held the Midnight Shard, he could feel a subtle presence, as though there was a deep well of power hiding inside of him, just beyond reach. He couldn't quite understand how to access that power yet, but it was certainly real. "I guess I'll have to win its favor first, but how do I do it? I'll have to experiment later." Admiring his new weapon, Sunny looked at Nephi's and said, "Even I know what type of sword this is. It's a katana, right?" She studied the Midnight Shard and then answered, "Technically, it's a takai. It's longer than a traditional katana and has a slightly different blade shape, but they're quite similar." A takai, well, It sounded nice anyway, and most of the principles he had learned with the Azure Blade could be applied to a sword of this type as well, since they shared the same foundation. The new acquisition wasn't quite enough to make Sonny forget about the loss of the Echo, but his mood did improve significantly. He liked the Midnight Shard a lot. There was beauty in its simple, resolute design. It was understated and deadly, kind of like Sonny himself. It was a significant upgrade. Suddenly, a dark thought appeared in Sonny's mind. Glancing at Nephi's, he cleared his throat and said after a bit of hesitation, it's a very nice weapon, Tier 3 no less. Are you sure that you don't want to keep it for yourself? Changing Star was the one to deal the final blow to the Carapace demon after all. By right, the memory belonged to her. But Sonny really hoped that she would refuse. Nephi shook her head. I already have a sword, it suits me. Inwardly, Sonny sighed with relief. Good, he thought. Makes you wonder, though, if she's unwilling to exchange her longsword for a Tier 3 weapon. Then what is the tier of that silver sword of hers? He didn't buy the idea that it simply suited Changing Star better even for a second. She had told him herself that the principle of using these types of swords was basically the same. Upgrading to the Midnight Shard and giving the old weapon to Sonny would not have caused her any problem. The only reason she would refuse it was that it would have been a downgrade instead. Once again, he became curious about the exact circumstances of how Neph had gotten her true name. To receive his own, Sonny had to kill an awakened tyrant. Could it be possible that she had done the same, or even something more incredible? But he was too tired to try and fish for information. They all were. Afraid that the strange winged creature they had seen devouring a dead centurion would appear again, this time to claim the remains of the Carapace demon. The three sleepers relocated to a far side of the island and hid behind the trunk of the great tree. Only when they were sure that nothing would be able to notice them from above did they finally allow the exhaustion to prevail and went to sleep. Sonny fell into dreamless darkness almost instantly, happy to finally be able to rest. However, this time something strange happened. He actually saw a dream. Strange, Sonny thought. This isn't supposed to happen in the dream realm, right? Then there was no more time to think. Sonny woke up from the insistent sense of alarm coming from his shadow. Groggy and disoriented, he opened his eyes and sat up. What's wrong? He looked down at the shadow and saw it repeatedly pointing up with a tense expression on its well. It didn't have a face. He could just tell that it was nervous. Trouble. Sonny looked up and saw nothing but the scarlet leaves of the great tree. The sky was hidden, but he could easily tell that the sun was still up. It seemed that he was asleep for just a few hours. There was no threat anywhere in sight. He frowned. What got you so spooked? The shadow just pointed up again, seemingly irritated by his stupidity. Sonny blinked a couple of times and addressed it again. High in the tree, higher in the sky. Finally satisfied, the shadow crossed its arms. Something dangerous is above the island, that creepy raven thing again. He had to check, but why did he feel as though he was forgetting something? Sonny scowled, trying to understand where this feeling of missing something important had come from. What was there to miss? He was asleep, then woke up and conversed with the shadow. Asleep. Suddenly, he remembered bits and pieces of a strange dream. At least it seemed like a dream, was it? People weren't supposed to dream in the dream realm. It was just how things worked, from what he knew. Only Cassie seemed to be an exception from this rule. He didn't remember much about this supposed dream of his, with even the remaining fragments already fading from his memory. There was a woman grabbing him by the shoulders, an expression of horror and panic on her face. She was saying something, but he couldn't hear what. No, not a woman, it was Cassie. Yes, it was her, and the thing she was saying. Sonny strained his memory, trying to catch the pieces of the dream before they completely disappeared. Yeah, I think she was saying, Suddenly, he could clearly hear Cassie's frightened, tense voice as she was hurriedly telling him to remember something, repeating the same sentence over and over again in a begging tone. You have to remember, Sonny. 5, it's 5, remember, you have to remember it's 5. What a strange dream. Sonny cast a glance at Cassie, who was sleeping peacefully near Neff, and shook his head in bewilderment. He wasn't sure if this memory of his was really a dream or some strange scene he had imagined right before falling asleep. With how the dream realm worked, he was leaning toward the latter possibility. Still, I better tell the girls when. He was distracted from this thought by the shadow, which waved its hands impatiently. Oh, right, there's a thread in the sky. Instantly, Sonny had forgotten all about his intention to share the contents of this strange memory of his with Nephi's and Cassie. In fact, he had forgotten that it was strange and possibly important altogether. This lapse in his judgment was sudden and unnatural, but since Sonny couldn't remember things that he had forgotten, he didn't notice anything amiss and went about his business as if nothing had happened. If he did, he could have realized that this might not have been the first time he had forgotten something important since they arrived at the Ashen Barrow. Standing up, Sonny summoned the midnight shard and glanced darkly at the blood-red leaves of the great tree. Feeling the coolness of the black polished hilt in his hand, he felt a little calmer. Woken up by his quiet movements, Nephi's opened her eyes and looked at him, her body tensing up. There was a silent question in her eyes. Sonny shook his head. I don't know yet. Stay with Cassie while I check things out. Leaving the girls behind, Sonny walked forward. He was planning to reach the edge of the island, where the branches of the colossal tree were not as thick, and the sky could be seen through the openings in its crown. Technically, he could have sent his shadow to do this instead of going himself. But in situations like this, where the danger was unknown, Sonny usually preferred to keep the shadow close by in case he needed to use it. Reaching the eastern slope of the Ashen Barrow, he carefully looked up, still hidden in the shadow of the great tree. Up above in the vast gray sky, a small black dot was circling around the island. Sonny's chest became heavy with wariness. Back when the terrible winged beast had first appeared, it looked exactly like this from the distance. Leaving the shadow behind to keep watch on the black dot, he returned and briefly told Nephi's and Cassie about his discovery. Right now, it's just flying above the island. I don't know if it's the same creature or not, and when it is going to land. Changing Star frowned. Last time, it wasn't very interested in searching for live prey. Perhaps it's mostly a carrion eater, and thus is only interested in the carapace demon's carcass. Cassie offered her own opinion. Maybe we're too weak and little to satiate it. After all, it never came for the corpses of the scavengers we had slain, as if eating mere beasts is beneath it. Sonny shook his head. Back then, it did come for the carapace centurion's meat, but it took a few scavengers with it as well before leaving. So it'll be too optimistic to think that this abomination will not try to devour us too if given a chance. Nephi's thought for a while, then gave him a nod. You're right. The best course of action would be to stay away from the carapace demon for now and hide when it decides to land. Then looking up, she added, but first, we must observe it to make sure that it's the same creature and confirm its intentions. Not having an argument against this logic, Sonny led the girls to the spot where he had left his shadow. There, they sat on the ground and watched the black dot as it circled around the Ashen Barrow. Observing the flying creature left them disturbed and unsure of what to do. The black dot drew closer a few times, allowing them to discern that it was indeed the same terrible monstrosity that they had encountered a few weeks before, or at least a creature of the same type. However, it never got too close to the crown of the great tree, as though hesitating to land in its shadow. What's worse, as hours passed by, It was joined by two other abominations of the same breed, each as horrifying and repulsive as the first one was. Now, three black dots were circling in the skies above their heads, filling Sunny's heart with dread. One of those creatures, with its corpse-like white body and raven-black feathers, with an unnatural mess of powerful limbs protruding from its wide chest, each ending with a set of terrifying talons, was enough to wipe out their entire group. The memory of how easily the creature had broken through the adamantine shell of the carapace centurion with its massive beak was still fresh in his mind. He suspected that these abominations were at least as powerful as the carapace demon was, or perhaps even more so. And now there were three of them. We'd better hide well, he thought, cold sweat running down his back. However, the flying monsters seemed to be reluctant to approach the ashen barrow for some reason. They just circled around it, sometimes hesitantly approaching, but then gaining height again. Their behavior was strange and disturbing. After some time, Cassie quietly said, "Maybe they're not hungry." Sunny blinked, trying to imagine a world where a nightmare creature might not be hungry. Was it even possible? He, on the other hand, "I don't know about these albino chickens, but I'm hungry as hell." This was true. The three of them had not eaten anything since yesterday. Sunny was afraid that if the abominations did decide to land on the island, the loud growls of his stomach would give away his position. Nephis glanced at him and asked, "Want to eat some grilled chicken?" Sunny opened his eyes wide and hissed, "Don't even think about it." She stared at him, then turned away with a smile. That was a joke. She knows how to joke. Well, at least someone's sense of humor was worse than his. In the end, their worst fears did not come true. After the sun began to roll toward the horizon, the three flying abominations finally made a decision and left the skis above the ashen barrow, flying west in a loose wedge formation. They never descended low enough to notice the three sleepers, let alone landing on the surface of the large island. Sunny was left drenched in sweat and tired from anticipating a disaster, almost disappointed at the fact that all this worrying had turned out to be for nothing. Looking at Cassie, who couldn't see that the danger had passed, he said, "They're gone." The blind girl exhaled with relief and relaxed, the frown disappearing from her face. Thank heavens! Sitting here and waiting was 5 times worse than hiding from one of them at those cliffs. For some reason, Sunny flinched a little. What did you say?" "I said that waiting for them to land was very tiresome." He blinked, not understanding why he had reacted so strangely to this innocuous sentence. Did he see a dream having to do with Cassie and number 5? Right, he did. Not that it was anything to think twice about. "Oh yeah, you're right." Then he turned to Nephis and asked, "What do you want to do now?" Changing Star looked west, where the black dots had disappeared from sight, and said after a short pause, "Let's check the western edge of the island and decide on the next high point to reach." Sunny shrugged, not having any objections. Cassie smiled. "Good idea. Who knows, maybe we'll finally see the walls of the castle." Soon they had crossed the island and approached its western slope. Here, the ground was raised just before plunging down, forming a natural rampart that hid the landscape from their eyes. Nephis was the first to climb up and reach the top. Sunny was just behind her when he felt that something was wrong. Changing Star's posture was somehow strange, stiff and rigid, as though she had suddenly turned to stone. Stepping on the ashen surface of the natural rampart, he worriedly looked at Nephis and noticed a grim, resentful expression on her face. He had never seen her in such a state before. Turning his head, Sunny looked west and then narrowed his eyes. His face instantly darkened. Feeling the desire to curse, Sunny gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. Inside his head, only one word was repeating over and over again. Damn, damn, damn. Beyond the western edge of the ashen barrow, The landscape of the forgotten shore was not at all like what Sunny had expected and hoped to see. On this side of the island, the slope was much steeper. At the spot where it was supposed to end, the familiar sight of the flat wasteland was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the ground continued to slope downward at a less drastic, but still considerably sharp angle. It continued far into the distance. In fact, the whole island appeared to be standing on the edge of a colossal depression in the earth, one that stretched as far as the eye could see. With its edges slightly curved, it resembled a giant crater left behind by an unimaginable impact. From what Sunny was able to observe, the crater's diameter could only be calculated in hundreds of kilometers. The roots of the giant tree, which could be seen protruding from the soil far below, seemed like tiny blades of grass in comparison to the sheer size of the abyssal chasm's wall. It was like the whole world was tilted on its side, making Sunny's head spin. In short, there were no more high natural features to the west of them. The only way forward was to go down, with no hope of finding shelter from the crushing torrents of the dark sea. Which meant that there was no way forward at all. Their journey to the west had come to an end. And with it, all hope of finding a gateway to the real world was lost. Sunny stared at the desolate landscape, feeling rage and disbelief clawing at his heart. He just couldn't believe that all their struggles were for nothing. But the proof was right in front of him, real and undeniable. Damn it all. He tried to think of some cunning way to solve the situation, but there was nothing his imagination could come up with. The dark sea with all its horrors drowned the world every night, and the only way to escape it was to climb high enough before the sunset. With no heights anywhere in sight, what could he do? Sunny glanced at Nephi's, who seemed to be even more crestfallen than him. Her face had turned into an icy mask, a dark look full of bitterness and resentment in her eyes. He opened his mouth, trying to come up with something to say, but no words came to his mind. In the end, they both remained silent until the distant rumble announced the return of the dark sea. Deep in the colossal crater, dark torrents appeared from beyond the horizon, rushing to fill it to the brim. A little bit stunned, Sunny watched as the water level rapidly rose, finally turning the endless chasm into a vast sea of black. Then, it began to overflow, sending an unstoppable flood of water into the wasteland. Flowing past the ashen barrow, it rushed inland, crushing against the coral of the crimson labyrinth. Soon, the whole world was covered in seething black water. Sunny licked his dry lips and turned to Nephi's. After a short pause, he said in a raspy voice, "I think we found the source of the dark sea." She lingered, watching the last rays of sunshine slowly disappear from the sky, then turned to him with a grim expression on her face. "Let's head back." All three of them felt lost and heartbroken because of the terrible discovery. Cassie in particular seemed to be utterly shocked. "It doesn't make sense, it just doesn't," she mumbled on their way to camp. "How could it be?" Gripping Sunny's shoulder, she quickened her step and asked, "Are you sure that there's nothing higher than the sea level out there? Are you absolutely sure?" He sighed, feeling his mood turning even darker than before. "Yes, we looked quite thoroughly. The whole land just goes down, down, and down. It stretches to the horizon as far as we could see in all directions except for the east. The ashen barrow is right on the edge." The blind girl shook her head. "But how could it be? I've seen that we had reached the castle. There must be a way." Sunny remained silent, not knowing how to answer. If there really was a way, he had no idea about it. After a few seconds, Nephi's answered instead of him. "We will try to come up with something tomorrow. Worst case scenario, we'll have to go around the whole thing." Sunny trembled at the thought. A journey like that would take months. To circle around the colossal crater, they would have to cover many times more distance than they had in the prior weeks, each day bringing the risk of stumbling onto something beyond their ability to resist. and each night bringing the risk of something stumbling onto them. The chances of surviving several months in this hellish place were nothing if not abyssal. Hi, abyssal. With a grimace, he tried to not think of the worst-case scenario. The darkness of the falling night was not the best environment for scary thoughts. Tomorrow, we'll rest, recharge, and think of something tomorrow. It is just like Cassie said, since she saw us entering the castle, there must be a way. They reached their temporary camp just before the sun had completely disappeared. Lying on the makeshift bed of fallen leaves, Sonny tiredly closed his eyes and thought, I hope I won't see any dreams today. Then he slightly frowned. Dreams? Since when am I capable of dreaming in this place? Oh, right, there was that one dream, or was it a memory? What was it about again? I can't seem to remember. With that thought disappearing from his mind, he fell asleep. In the morning, the mood between the three of them was pretty somber. No one seemed to want to talk or do anything, aimlessly staring at the ground or the rustling leaves of the great tree. In addition to the blow of yesterday's revelation, they were also hungry. The corpse of the carapace demon was starting to look more and more appealing, at least to Sonny. However, he was still not at the point of breaking his promise to Cassie. Finally, Nephi's broke the silence. Standing up, she looked up with grim resolution and said, I'm going to climb to the top of the tree and take a look around. Maybe I'll notice something that we missed from up high. Sonny stared at the giant tree, suddenly feeling incredibly small. It was truly enormous. The ashen barrow itself was already much taller than the giant knight's statue and every other shelter they had seen, and the tree almost dwarfed it in size. Climbing all the way up would take a lot of time and effort. But maybe she would really be able to notice something from that incredible height. He scratched the back of his head and said, All right, but be careful. Keep an eye on the sky. If you notice those winged abominations again, come back down. Changing Star gave him a nod and headed for the tree. Without turning her head, she calmly said as a farewell, Take care of Cassie while I'm gone. It shouldn't be more than a few hours. Sonny waved a hand and watched her walk away. Then he tried to think of something to do. On a usual day, he would have already started his morning training, but today he was too hungry. Come on, hunger is not an excuse. Do you think you'll always have a full stomach before a battle? No, so get up and train. Don't you want to try how the midnight shard feels in your hand? With a sigh, Sonny got up. He trained for an hour, enjoying the swift and reliable feeling of his new sword. The long takai was truly incredible. It was light, maneuverable, and unrelenting. Its edge sang as it cut the air. Sonny already felt as though it was a part of him. His movements were fluid and measured, almost elegant. After the training session was over, he decided to do something useful. Walking over to the carapace demon's corpse, Sonny spent some time prying the soul shard out of it. In the end, he gathered all 3 of the crystals with some effort and stashed them into the seaweed rucksack. What to do now? After a bit of pondering, he suddenly got an idea and tried to find the place from his memory. The one where the carapace demon had dropped the transcendent soul shard into the sand. That shard had been brought to the ashen barrow by the subservient centurion and would be a real treat for Neph or Cassie. He quickly found the right spot. However, no matter how hard Sonny looked, he couldn't find the alluring crystal. In the process, a couple more hours had passed by. Stange, it was quite large. Where could it be? He was determined to continue the search. But at that moment, the shadow that he had left with Cassie noticed movement in the branches of the great tree. Nephi's was back. Sonny walked back to the camp, thinking about what she had found. Was there hope for them after all, or was there only more bad news? By the time he returned, Neph and Cassie were sitting on the ground with relaxed expressions on their faces. She saw something, Sonny thought, suddenly excited. But in the next second, his eyes widened. The two girls were holding something in their hands, their lips painted red. They were eating. They were eating the fruits of the great tree. Sonny stumbled and looked at his companions in utter shock. Nephi and Cassie were each holding a large, round, glistening fruit. The skin of these fruits was smooth and black as onyx, while the succulent insides were red as ruby. Their hands, chins, and lips were smeared with red juice, making it look as though they were feasting on blood. The air was filled with an alluring, sweet aroma. Sonny recoiled, but his stomach involuntarily growled, reminding him how hungry he was. Nephi looked at Sonny and offered him a relaxed smile. "Hey." He stared at her, lost for words. Finally, after a few seconds had passed, Sonny collected himself and screamed. "What do you mean, hey? What the hell are you doing?" His voice was loud, full of disbelief and anger. Both Neff and Cassie turned to face him. They were visibly confused. "Why are you shouting?" Sonny gaped at them, feeling like he had lost his mind. Why were they so nonchalant about this? What was going on here? Trying to find some sense in the situation, he took a cautious step forward and looked at Nephi. Did she wait? What was he thinking about? He was so hungry. It was hard to concentrate on anything except for food. Shaking off the unexpected memory lapse, Sonny remembered what he was about to say and pressed. "Why did you change your mind?" Changing Star frowned. "Changed my mind about what?" He clenched his teeth, thinking that she was trying to fool him. "About the fruits. I thought we had agreed to avoid eating them." Nephi's blinked, a confused expression appearing on her face. "Did we? Why?" Sonny opened his mouth to answer, but then froze. Actually, why did they make that agreement? I can't quite remember." He was sure that there was a reason, but his memory was completely blank. There definitely was an agreement, wasn't there? He was pretty sure that there was, at least up until a few moments ago. Now, however, did he imagine the whole thing? There really was no reason not to eat the alluring fruits, especially when the three of them were so hungry. "No, wait, that's not right. Are you all right, Sonny?" He flinched and glanced at Nephi, who was looking at him with concern. Suddenly, Sonny felt lost and confused. What were they talking about? Something about some sort of agreement. What agreement? Not knowing how to answer, he just stood there with a frown on his face and pouted. This is embarrassing. Did I completely space out while she was talking to me?" Fortunately, Cassie quickly came to his rescue. She always knew how to make the situation less awkward. "Are you angry because we started eating without you?" He looked at her and noticed the big, delicious fruit in her hands. His stomach growled. "So hungry." "Oh, I guess." Cassie smiled and pointed to the ground, where another fruit was placed on the pile of fallen leaves. Her teeth were smeared with red juice. "Don't worry, Neff brought 3 of them, 1 for each." "How nice of her." Sonny picked up the fruit, looked at it, and took a bite without thinking. Instantly, his mouth was filled with delightful, cool sweetness. The succulent, juicy fruit was probably the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. It was both nourishing and refreshing, with rich texture and soft, lingering aftertaste. The ruby flesh practically melted on his tongue, making his whole body tingle. It was pure joy in the form of a fruit. Wow! Despite his delight, Sonny felt disturbed for some reason. Something was very wrong about the whole situation, but what? Taking another bite, he frowned and tried to understand the source of this anxious feeling. It was hard to think about anything except for how heavenly the fruit of the soul tree tasted, but he forced himself to concentrate. Soul tree, since when? Wait, don't get distracted. Sonny was finally able to pinpoint the source of the strangeness. It was his shadow. When he reached out to pick up the fruit, the shadow did not copy his movements, as though reluctant to touch it. Even now it was motionless, refusing to mimic him eating the fruit. Weird, what is it with this guy? Sunny took one more bite and looked at the shadow, lost in thought. The shadow had an eccentric temper, but it rarely did something without a reason. If it didn't like the fruit, there had to be something wrong with the fruit. Sunny frowned, suddenly feeling a sense of dread grip his heart. There was something wrong with the... Damn, why is it so hard to think about this stuff? There was something wrong with the fruit. Why would there? Wait, is this why I screamed at Nephi's? She broke an agreement. What was the agreement? Sunny was at the precipice of remembering something very important. He felt as though he just needed to pull on the thread, and the whole truth would reveal itself. Something terrible was going to happen if he failed. But then Sunny got distracted. Something unexpected happened, something that required his full attention. Instantly, he somehow forgot all about the problem with the soul tree's fruits. Because at that moment, the spell was talking into his ear. Your shadow grows stronger. What? He blinked, then looked at the delicious fruit in his hands. The spell announced the increase in his power right after Sunny swallowed his third bite. Stunned, he raised his head and looked at Nephi's. Changing Star, too, was staring at her fruit with a strange expression on her face. Feeling his gaze, she looked up. Sunny licked his lips. Did you? At the same time, Nephi said, I just absorbed a point of soul essence. Without saying anything, they both turned to Cassie. The blind girl was enthusiastically devouring the fruit. Red juice was flowing down her chin and dripping to the ground. Stopping for a moment, she smiled. Actually, I received mine a few bites ago. Sunny's eyes widened. Excitedly, he summoned the runes and found the right cluster. Shadow fragments, 97/1000. He really received a fragment. He received a shadow fragment without risking his life in a battle against deadly monsters. Finally, Sunny was able to realize why the carapace demon had been so fixated on the soul tree and its fruits. These fruits were pure magic. Forgetting all about the uneasy feeling, he raised his hand and greedily bit into the succulent, delicious, nourishing flesh. Late in the evening, when the sun was already hidden behind the horizon, and the dark sea had once again turned the Ashen Barrow into a lonely island, the three of them were preparing for the night. They had moved their camp to rest between the roots of the great tree. With newfound energy received from consuming miraculous fruits, all their worries seemed to fade. With no way to move further west, Nephi's, Sunny and Cassie had decided to rest for a few days before making any decisions. They deserved a short vacation. The Ashen Barrows was a perfect place to recuperate. There were no monsters in the surrounding wasteland. It was large enough to protect them from the horrors of the sea, and they had plenty of food thanks to the soul tree. What's more, that food could even provide them with power. Where else would they be able to grow stronger without risking their lives? As far as hell goes, this place was almost a paradise. Sunny lay on the makeshift mattress of fallen leaves, feeling relaxed and optimistic for the first time in many, many days. Things seemed to be getting better. Before falling asleep, he glanced at the mighty branches of the great tree and thought with a bit of regret. With the carapace demon gone, there's no one to protect this magnificent tree anymore. When we continue our journey, it will be completely defenseless. What a shame. His consciousness was already half asleep. However, one last thought entered Sunny's mind right before he completely slipped into the embrace of darkness. What a shame that no one will be here to serve it, and feed it, and help it spread its seeds. In the morning, Sunny was woken up by the gentle rustling of leaves. Opening his eyes, he saw rays of sunshine falling through the scarlet crown of the soul tree, painting the world in soft shades of pink. The sight was beautiful and tranquil. It felt as though none of the dangers and terrors of the dream realm could reach him here. A soft breeze touched his skin, bringing with it coolness and the smell of fallen leaves. For the first time in a long while, Sunny felt at peace. Is this what a vacation feels like? If so, their decision to have one was the best decision ever. He sat up with a yawn and lazily looked around. Cassie and Nephi's were already awake. Seeing them put a smile on Sunny's face. Why the hell am I grinning? Shaking his head, Sunny put on a serious expression and said, "Good morning." The girls greeted him. Then Nephi slightly tilted her head and asked, "Hey, do you remember why we didn't leave anyone to keep watch last night?" Sunny blinked. Indeed, why hadn't anyone guarded the camp? No, I guess we were too tired. Plus, it's so safe here. Why deprive ourselves of sleep?" She frowned. Sunny expected Changing Star to berate them, but unexpectedly she just shrugged. "I guess." That's not like her. Am I not the only one in a great mood?" To make Neff feel better, he pointed down and said, "Don't worry, my shadow would have warned us if anything had happened." She seemed to have forgotten about her question already, returning to whatever she had been doing before. All three of them were easily distracted these days. Sunny sighed. "So, what are you guys going to do today?" Cassie turned to him with a smile and answered in a teasing tone. "Nothing, we're on vacation, remember, so we're just going to rest and relax." Sounds like a plan. Speaking about plans. At that moment, Cassie scowled and said with a comically strict expression, "You too, Sunny, you are not allowed to plan, plot, and scheme. Just sit back and enjoy the day, all right?" Sunny scratched the back of his head. "All right." He felt as though he was forgetting something. "But what?" Looking at Nephi's, Sunny hesitated and asked, "Remind me, why did you climb the soul tree yesterday?" She glanced at him in confusion. I don't really remember, to get the fruits." Sunny smiled at the mention of the miraculous fruits and nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense." A few days passed by. Sunny, Nephi's, and Cassie spent them idling away, not concerned with anything in the world. Their tired bodies and minds needed time to rest. They slept until noon, ate the delightful fruits, and sat around the fire, talking or simply soaking in the warmth. Sometimes they would play games or engage in other forms of entertainment. Other times they would keep to themselves, enjoying the almost forgotten feeling of privacy. Sunny had been a loner for most of his life, so these past few weeks that he had spent side by side with other people, without even a minute to himself, were a taxing experience. He relished the opportunity to be alone with his thoughts once again. Luckily, the island was large enough for the three of them to stay apart if they didn't wish to be disturbed. Not that it happened often. At first, he had expected that lazing around doing nothing would very quickly grow boring, but surprisingly, it did not. He felt perfectly fine simply laying on the ground and staring at the gently swaying branches of the soul tree, caught in a blissful reverie. In moments like these, he would lose track of time, often realizing that entire hours had passed only when the sun was about to set. The concept of time, in general, had become strangely hard to grasp. Sunny wasn't entirely sure how many days they had spent on the peaceful island. He was pretty sure that it was less than a week, but couldn't remember the exact amount. Not being able to remember something had become a common occurrence. All three of them were turning increasingly absent-minded and forgetful. Sometimes, Sunny would catch himself straining to remember details of his previous life or notice the strangeness of their behavior. But a minute later, he would forget about these concerns, distracted by some innocuous thought or occurrence. His memory was becoming hazier and hazier. The only clear things in it were how delicious and refreshing the magical fruits were, how pleasant it was to live under the shade of the soul tree, and how magnificent it was. The tree was beautiful, benevolent, and generous. It protected them from the cursed blight of the Crimson Labyrinth, kept the monsters away, and provided nourishment both for their bodies and for their soul cores. Sunny was becoming increasingly convinced that finding the majestic soul tree was a true blessing. The thought of leaving its gifts behind and returning to the horror of the outside world seemed less and less attractive. Why leave when they were perfectly happy here? Well, at least two of them were. While Nephi's was as carefree and tranquil as Sunny and Cassie in the beginning, as time went by, she grew strangely despondent and gloomy. It seemed as though she had reverted back to her old, distant, and unsociable self. Instead of chatting or relaxing with them, Changing Star ended up spending most of her time sitting on the western edge of the island alone, staring into the distance with bleak eyes. Sunny had no idea what was wrong. He was worried about her. Not even the frequent, insistent lapses of memory managed to overcome his concern about Neff. On one of the evenings, Sunny approached the western slope of the island, feeling as though his head was about to split from pain. For some reason, he kept forgetting the reason for this visit on the way here. It took all of his willpower to hold on to his intentions. He wanted to check on Nephi's. Just like always, she was sitting at the ridge of the western edge, gazing into the distance. Sunny climbed onto the ridge and sat down, looking at her with hesitation. "Hey, Neph." Changing Star glanced at him. Her indifferent expression was back, making any attempt to understand her true emotions futile. However, it was clear that she was not all right. "Hey." Sunny scratched the back of his head. Was he seeing things, or was her hair a bit longer than before? "Why aren't you enjoying the vacation?" Changing Star frowned. After a while, she said, "Don't we need to keep moving west?" He raised his eyebrows, surprised. "West? What is in the west?" Neff's frown deepened, turning into a scowl. I don't remember, but I feel. She grew silent, then said quietly, "I feel like I have to do something very important." Abandon the soul tree. What a strange idea. Sunny pondered for some time, trying to understand where she got the idea that they had to move somewhere. Finally, he asked, "Why west of all directions?" Nephi's turned to him. There was a strange, pained expression on her face. Gritting her teeth, she whispered, "I don't know." Sunny sighed. If she didn't know, then he, of course, had no idea either. All he knew was that he wanted to make her feel better. But how? Sunny frowned, trying to think of a way. He felt that there was something very obvious that he was forgetting, something that would instantly erase Neff's suffering. When the realization hit him, he froze. Of course, how could I forget? The answer was so clear. He just had to climb the soul tree and find an especially juicy fruit for her to eat. It was already dark when Sunny returned to the great tree. Cassie was asleep, snuggled comfortably under her cloak. There was a peaceful smile on her face. Sweet dreams. She wasn't bothered by her terrible visions in a long time. Everything became better since they decided to stay on the tranquil island. Everything except for Neff's mood. She didn't even bother to return to camp today, staying at the western edge of the barrow. Sunny didn't like that she was so close to the black water. He sighed. I need to get some tasty fruits for her as soon as possible. She definitely would not be able to stay sad after eating the magical fruits. They were so sweet and delicious. Sunny began salivating just from thinking about them. Maybe I'll find one for myself too. In the beginning, they took turns climbing to the lower branches of the soul tree to gather fruits. Lately, though, Nephi seemed to be distracted by her strange melancholy. As the result, the group relied on him to bring down fruits for everyone. He had already picked the lowest branches clean, choosing the ripest fruits first. Later ones were smaller and not as heavenly, although they still tasted amazing. Since each fruit was big enough to satiate a person for a long time, they rarely ate more than one in a day. The ripest fruits provided Sunny with one or two shadow fragments, while the smaller ones gave one or even none at all. I wonder how many shadow fragments I accumulated. Should be more than 100, right? Maybe even 110. No, no way. We've been here just for a few days, a week at most. He could just summon the runes and check, but somehow that thought didn't even occur to him. If it did, he would have been horrified. Forgetting all about the shadow fragments, Sonny looked up and scratched the back of his head. Initially, he was planning to climb the tree in the morning and explore higher than he had previously gone, looking for the best, most delicious fruit possible to give to Neff. But after thinking about it, he decided to not wait until the night was over. He could see perfectly in the dark, after all, and this way, he would be able to give Changing Star a delightful present much sooner. Stepping close to the trunk of the miraculous tree, Sonny began climbing. The first stretch was the most difficult since he had nothing to grab except for small cracks and bumps on the smooth, obsidian bark. Reaching the branches required a lot of effort. However, he was already accustomed to it. Moving his hands and feet almost on instinct, Sonny got higher and higher. Soon, he was already pulling himself on top of an enormous, wide branch. These first branches were as wide as roads. He sat down and rested for some time, enjoying the coolness of the night air. Sonny had never climbed the sole tree in the dark before. Without the bright sunbeams falling through the leaves, it looked strangely different. The vibrant magnificence was gone, replaced with eerie stillness. The rustling of scarlet leaves did not seem calming and tranquil anymore. In fact, it made Sonny shudder. It sounded like thousands and thousands of trapped souls, all screaming in agony. What's up with me today? How can I even think of such things? What a fool. Good thing that the great tree can't hear me, otherwise I'd be so ashamed. Please forgive me, soul tree. Shaking his head, Sonny stood up and continued climbing. He was very disappointed in himself. After all the good things that the tree had given them, he had stupidly doubted its benevolence, its greatness, its desire to devour, always ravenous, always growing, starving, hungry, forever. How ungrateful. Why did he even begin to think about, What exactly was he thinking about? Sonny frowned, failing to recall his train of thought. Whatever. I'm here to find a tasty fruit for Neff. Not practice my reasoning. Climbing higher and higher, he soon abandoned the area that they had explored before. The crown of the great tree was vast enough to form a maze of its own. The large branches grew chaotically in all directions, twisting and crossing each other, with thick foliage blocking lines of sight and making any attempt of looking for the fruits difficult and time-consuming. Still, Sonny was determined to continue. He figured that if he went really high, where sunlight was denser, the fruits would be much riper. They had never tried a fruit from the higher branches. If he could find a really amazing one, Nephi's would have to change her mind and abandon her strange thoughts of leaving the island. After all, these fruits were magical. Maybe she'll even smile. Encouraged, Sonny continued climbing. Time slowly passed. After a long while, Sonny finally decided that he had climbed high enough. He wasn't sure how many hours ago he had started the ascent, but judging by the soreness of his muscles and the visibly diminished width of the branches, he was somewhere in the upper part of the tree. Stepping on one of the branches, he slowly walked forward and looked from side to side. Searching for the fruits was not easy. It required good perception and patience. And a great sense of equilibrium, of course. Falling from this height would not be a great experience. In fact, it would be his last. Carefully observing the surroundings, Sonny moved further and further away from the trunk of the great tree. The branches were softly swaying under his feet. A few times, he jumped from one to another, causing a change in the melody of rustling leaves. On the way, he noticed several hanging fruits. They looked ripe and delicious, but none of them was really special, and he wanted to find the most wonderful fruit possible. Finally, Sonny got so far that the branches grew really narrow and thin. Now, They were almost the same size as those of a normal tree, barely able to support his weight. But he still did not find a suitable gift for Nephi's. Sunny helplessly looked around, crestfallen. He really thought that he would be able to. Then he noticed something strange. Some distance away from him, the branches just above the one he was standing on were twisted downward, as though weighed down by something. However, he couldn't quite see what it was behind the almost impenetrable wall of leaves. In fact, he only noticed the anomaly because it was dark. In the light of day, the bright color of the sole tree's foliage would make the shape of the branches indiscernible. But in Sunny's night vision, all colors were muted, almost turning into various shades of gray. Interesting. Jumping, he grabbed onto a higher branch and pulled himself up. Then, careful not to fall, Sunny approached the leaf barrier and forced his way through. In the process, he had to enhance his strength and agility with the help of the shadow. Otherwise, he would either have had to turn back or tumble down to his death. Finally, he freed himself from the last layer of leaves and took a step forward. Then Sunny froze, his eyes opening wide with wonder. Right in front of him, hidden from the world in the secretive pocket of twisted branches, a giant, elaborate bird nest rested between the scarlet leaves. The nest was spherical in shape, with a round hole at the center of it. Usually, such a nest would be made out of grass and twigs, but this one was constructed from the branches of the great tree, each at least as thick as a man's arm. These branches were twisted and interwoven together in a chaotic pattern, creating gapless, onyx-black walls. Sunny had never seen anything like it. Birds were a rare sight in the real world, let alone giant ones. The size of the entrance into the nest was large enough for a small truck to pass through. The nest itself was several times bigger. Wow! For a second he felt a sense of fear, afraid that the giant bird was somewhere near. But then his fears disappeared. The nest looked abandoned. It was ancient and empty, some of its parts already on the verge of collapse. It was as though thousands of years had passed since anyone had been in this hidden, secretive place. The air was filled with the feeling of lonesomeness and desolation. Makes sense. If I barely managed to pass through the leaves, how would a giant monster do it without leaving a giant hole in the barrier? Sunny hesitated, caution and curiosity wrestling against each other inside his heart. On one hand, exploring ancient nests was not the best of ideas anywhere, let alone inside the dream realm. It posed great risks. On the other hand, it also could lead to a great reward. Plus, wasn't it just too damn interesting? In the end, Sunny decided to climb inside the nest to satiate his curiosity. He had convinced himself that it was safe following an unexpected train of thought. In his warped state of mind, Sunny was convinced that the soul tree was a great and benevolent being, one that protected them from the terrible threats hiding in the outside world. If so, how could anything having to do with the great tree be unsafe? Moving closer to the entrance of the nest, he balanced on the edge of the branch and tried to look inside. However, he wasn't tall enough to see anything except for the inner side of the nest's roof. Since his position was pretty precarious, Sunny decided not to delay the inevitable and jumped, throwing himself up and over the lip of the entrance. A moment later, he landed on a soft surface. The lower part of the nest was covered in a thick cushion of white, silky spiderwebs. Time had made them brittle and pliable like sand. There was so much spiderweb around that, for a moment, Sunny thought that he had fallen into a giant white cocoon. But no, it was just a nest. And there, in the center of it, was a... Sunny blinked. At the center of the nest, there was an egg. A giant, ancient egg that was as tall as he was, gray and seemingly lifeless, as though turned to stone by the passage of time. Forgetting to breathe, Sunny looked around, making sure that there was nothing and no one else around. But no, the giant nest was empty and silent, with not even a stray shadow hiding anywhere in sight. How fascinating! Sunny felt strangely excited. The feeling of discovering something incredible, something that no one except for him had ever seen, filled him with a deep sense of wonder and satisfaction. He had never known that there was such a side to him, one full of an explorer's passion. Let's check this thing out. Walking on the soft silk, Sunny slowly circled the massive egg and studied it. At a first glance, it seemed to be made of stone. The surface of the egg was colored in various shades of gray, which were overlaid over each other like moving clouds. This pattern was strangely beautiful, giving the egg a mysterious aura. But overall, it was just big and smooth. Sunny scratched the back of his head, then stepped closer and put his hand on the surface of the egg. Immediately, he felt a strong sense of astonishment. The egg was warm to the touch. Is it still alive? In the next second, Sunny felt a strange pull affecting his core. It was as though the egg was trying to steal his life force. He jerked his hand away and looked at the egg with dark apprehension. The damned thing was not only alive, but also capable of sucking the life out of anything that touched it. It only failed to eat his soul because of one reason. As far as Sunny knew, he was the only existence in two worlds without an actual soul core. He had the mysterious shadow core instead. That's why his life force had not been affected. Phew, that was close. Looking at the giant egg, Sunny thought about how to get back at it. The nest, without a doubt, once belonged to an extremely powerful nightmare creature. Therefore, its spawn was also a being of considerable strength. However, due to some unknown reason, that being had not been able to hatch and was left behind by its parent, destined to remain trapped within the egg for all eternity. Or at least until some unfortunate fool came close enough to feed it with soul essence and give it enough power to break free. Luckily, I'm not a fool. Wait, maybe I am. His decisions have been very strange lately. He couldn't quite explain some of them, including this latest one. It was as though his thinking ability had been reduced. Whatever, I'm still smarter than a damn egg. Like a true explorer, he went where no one had gone before and made an incredible discovery. He found an unbelievably mysterious, rare being, one that not a single human had ever heard of. Naturally, he had to kill it. That's what the spirit of exploration was all about, wasn't it? Summoning the midnight shard, Sunny thrust it into the stone surface of the egg, causing a rain of sparks to fall on the spiderwebs. The sharp blade slid harmlessly across the stone, leaving only a shallow scratch on it. Tough bastard. The egg was sturdy enough to withstand a strike from an awakened weapon. If it was that resilient, Sunny was scared to imagine how powerful the adult monster would be. It was definitely not an average nightmare creature. But then, he was not an average sleeper. His shadow flowed from his hands onto the midnight shard, turning the polished metal of the blade black and lusterless. Immediately, a cold aura radiated from the sword, making it feel sharp enough to cut the world apart. Stepping forward, Sunny raised the shard above his head and sliced down, delivering a crushing blow. Enhanced by the shadow, the dark blade bit into the stone surface of the egg and split it apart. Cracks ran through the giant stone egg as Sunny's sword plunged into it. A flash of sinister crimson light shined through the cracks, then disappeared, leaving behind nothing but darkness. A torrent of viscous, black liquid flowed onto the white spiderwebs. In the ensuing silence, Sunny heard the spell's bewitching voice. You have slain a great devil, vile thieving bird's spawn. Your shadow grows stronger. You have received a memory, Sunny blinked. You have received a memory, drop of ichor. Wait a moment, wait a moment. A great devil, he gulped. Nightmare creature with 4 soul cores was called a devil, just one class below the dreaded tyrant. From that detail alone, the evil ancient egg had been potentially more powerful than the carapace demon. However, what shocked him the most was its rank, not class. The quality of most things having to do with the nightmare spell followed a similar hierarchy, from dormant to awakened, ascended, transcendent, supreme, sacred, and divine. Humans had only ever managed to reach the transcendent rank. These heroes were known as saints, each wielding an unimaginable amount of power and leading humanity in its war against the nightmare creatures. The nightmare creatures, too, were different from each other in a similar fashion, with 7 ranks of power. They were in order of growing strength: dormant, awakened, fallen, corrupted, great, cursed, and unholy. A great devil, therefore, was a nightmare creature with 4 soul cores, each one of the great rank, which were the same in terms of power as a supreme soul core would have been if a human ever managed to pass the 4th nightmare and rise one step above the saints. Sunny had just killed one of the most powerful nightmare creatures to ever fall by a human hand, at least as far as he knew. Victories against the great devils were rare enough to be of historic importance. God, what a stroke of luck to find one absolutely defenseless, yet to be fully born and weakened by thousands of years of neglect. Not to mention the fact that he was probably the only human alive to be partially immune to the egg's terrifying life-sucking powers. Wait, how many shadow fragments did I get? Sunny felt stronger, a lot stronger. He was used to receiving 2 fragments for each awakened beast he killed. Thus, it was fair to assume that a fallen beast would give him 4, a corrupted beast would give him 8, and a great beast would give him 16. Forgetting the ridiculousness of the notion that a sleeper would ever be able to slay a great beast. However, the vile thieving bird's spawn was not a beast, it was a devil. It had 4 cores, so 64 fragments. Dumbstruck, Sunny summoned the runes. In his excited state, he even disregarded the insistent forgetfulness that prevented him from doing so earlier. Shadow fragments, 196/1000. After seeing the number, he was giddy with joy at first, but then Sunny frowned. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. I had 96 fragments before coming to the Ashen Barrow. I received 64 just now, that makes it 160. Where did the additional 36 fragments come from? From the fruits? No way, we've been eating them for less than a week, 1 fruit a day. To get that much, a whole month would have to pass. But how could so much time pass without him noticing? Yes, his memory was strange lately, but... Sunny tried to concentrate on the discrepancy, but it was very hard for some reason. The more he thought about it, the less clear he became on what exactly he was thinking about. What was I trying to remember? Something about the shadow fragments. Yeah. A few minutes later, he massaged his temples and sighed in frustration. I guess I was trying to calculate how many fragments I got from killing that vile egg. It's 64. What is there to think about? That is great. He would spend more time celebrating the insane amount of shadow fragments he had received. But there was another amazing thing waiting for his attention. A memory. He had actually received a memory from a great devil, a real, actual supreme memory of the 4th tier. That was. Fantastic. Sunny summoned the runes once more and looked at his memories. Memory, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Midnight Shard, Drop of Ichor. Hurriedly, he concentrated on the new one. Memory, Drop of Ichor. Memory rank, unknown. Memory type, unknown. Memory description. The loathsome thieving bird was hated both by the gods and, however, it only cared about shiny things. Enamored by Weaver's beautiful eyes, it stole one of them on a dark, starless night. Impatient, the vile creature looked at its bounty while still in flight. However, when it saw the reflection of unknown forever frozen in the depths of Weaver's pupil, it went mad and screamed, dropping the eye on the mortal realm below. All that was left in its greedy beak was 1 drop of pure, golden ichor. Sunny frowned. What the hell was that? He had never heard of a memory with an unknown rank and type. How was this even possible? Did the spell really not know, or was it simply refusing to let him know? Why would it do that? And the description itself, what were these words that it failed to translate? He tried to forgo the automatic translation and look at the runes themselves, but they were beyond his ability to translate. In fact, he had never seen runes of this type before. Weirdly, studying them caused him to feel dizzy and nauseated. That is very, very weird. Also, to his shame, Sonny had to admit that he had no idea what the word ichor meant. It simply wasn't in his vocabulary. Maybe if he went to school and got an education like other sleepers, he would know. Sonny hesitated for a minute or two, then cautiously summoned the strange memory. Instantly, golden sparks of light appeared in the air in front of him, coalescing into a spherical drop of radiant, golden liquid. What am I supposed to do with thigh? Before he finished his thought, the spell spoke again. Its voice sounded a bit strange. It was almost excited. You have acquired a drop of ichor. Do you wish to consume it? Sonny blinked. Consume a memory. Things were getting weirder and weirder. He hesitated. What was going to happen if he did consume it? Memories were rewards given by the spell to the awakened. As such, they were usually useful, very rarely useless, and never harmful. At least that was the common knowledge. However, this one was out of the ordinary, and it was the spell he was talking about. The damn thing was nothing if not unpredictable, usually with catastrophic consequences. The safest approach would be to put the golden liquid back into his soul sea and never touch it again. But it was a memory received from a great devil. Chances were he would never hold another one in his whole life, not even in his dreams. Sonny was simply unwilling to let this opportunity go. Trying to calm his rapidly beating heart, he licked his lips and said, "Yes, I want to consume it." "As you wish." The golden sphere separated into two streams of beautiful, radiant liquid. The streams flowed through the air, approaching Sonny's face. He felt a gentle touch caress his cheeks. Then the golden liquid reached his eyes and flowed through them, entering his soul through the pupils. Soon it was gone. Sonny was frozen, not knowing what to expect. A second passed, then another. He raised his trembling hands to his face, finally feeling something. In the next moment, Sonny opened his mouth and let out a terrible, wailing shriek as unimaginable. Blinding pain tore through his entire being. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be SUPRISC for all of you. Stay tuned.